Well, welcome everyone to today's Preservation Academy. I'm Elizabeth Kostelny, CEO for Preservation Virginia. We'll begin our session, as we always do, with some heartfelt thank yous. The first goes to our panelists today who've invested time and energy in preparing their remarks and presentations. I know you'll be very thrilled to hear their wisdom this afternoon. I want to also extend our gratitude to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources for their support and their collaboration on the 2023 series of educational offerings. And we wouldn't be here without the support from our sponsors: Peachtree House Foundation, Daniel and Company, Monument Companies, Historic Richmond, and Commonwealth Advisors. And I want to thank each of you. Your registration fees help underwrite this programming and our other educational and community engagement endeavors. Today's section focuses on community efforts to save resources. And I can't tell you how often the phone rings, and when we answer, there's a community volunteer on the other end of the line who is concerned about the demolition of a historic building, threats to a historic cemetery from a proposed transportation project, or wants more information on how to stabilize and save a structure. Those questions are variations on a theme, but they always come, the next thing that happens is the question comes, where do we begin? Who do we call? How do we organize? We'll explore those questions more with our gifted panelists in just a moment, but first, a bit of housekeeping. To make sure we use the most of our time together, we'll hold questions to the end. You may send us your questions at any time by writing them in the Q&A box. You can also use the chat box to share comments with fellow attendees, and we'll also be putting additional information in the chat box as we go through the program. We'll be responding to as many questions as we have time, but Sonia is always good at following up with those questions that we didn't get a chance to answer during this session. So look for more information in your inbox following the program. You can turn on the closed caption by going onto the bottom of the Zoom screen and locate the three dots that'll say that more. Click on captions and show captions, and instructions will be put in the chat box as well. This session is being recorded, and in a couple of days from now, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. And you can also check out Preservation Virginia's and DHR's websites for links. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Sonia Ingram, to introduce our panelists. Sonia has worked tirelessly on this series of webinars. In addition, she's often the person on the other end of those calls, responding to individuals and organizations interested in preserving sites in their local area. Sonia, we greatly appreciate your work, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I am going to read the title and name of our speakers today, but I want to let you know that the full bios will be on our website. So our first panelist will be Blake McDonald. Blake is the manager of Architectural Survey and Cost Share Grant Program at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. Our second panelist is Zarina Fazalden. Zarina is the co-owner and president of L&Z Historic LLC in Richmond. And our third and final presenter is Mr. Kyle Hart. Kyle is the Mid-Atlantic Program Director of the National Parks Conservation Association. So at this point, I will just turn it over to Blake, and he will share his screen and give his presentation.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and thank you, Elizabeth. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to everyone who's taking time out of their day to join us. Okay, Sonia, can I get a thumbs up that you can see my my screen? Excellent. All right. Well, again, my name is Blake McDonald, and I'm the Architecture Survey Manager at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to speak to you about the importance of documenting historic places through survey, what that means, why we do it, and how you can access survey records for historic resources. If there's one thing that I want you to take away from the presentation today, it's that the documentation of historic resources through survey is the essential foundational first step towards the other preservation activities that you'll hear from Zarina and from Kyle and just across the board, across historic preservation. Whether you're supporting preservation by creating a citizen board to oversee development in your community, or you're engaging in any type of preservation advocacy, or installing interpretive signage or art installations about the history of your neighborhood, these are all meaningful and worthwhile preservation pathways, but you can't do any of that until you know what you have. And a historic resource survey gives you that information. So I always like to start with some basics. On this slide, you'll see the Virginia Department of Historic Resources mission statement. The Department of Historic Resources, or DHR, is the State Historic Preservation Office. Every state and territory has one, has since the mid-1960s with the National Historic Preservation Act. Whenever introducing DHR, I think it's important to define exactly what we mean when we say historic resource. That's such a broad term. There are a lot of definitions out there, but for today, the most important thing to keep in mind is that it's not just buildings. It's not just old buildings. Historic resources can be objects, sites, structures, and even concentrations of historic resources that we call historic districts, so entire areas. A few of our program areas that you might be more familiar with include the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places, which we administer here in Virginia. These two lists are kind of like the honor roll of historic resources that are important at a local, state, or national level here in Virginia. Listing on the registers does not entail restrictions to property owners, so it's the great way to celebrate the history of an important place. Folks who own listed resources can opt into our robust state and federal rehabilitation tax credit program. Virginia has one of the largest tax credit programs in the nation. And then, of course, we have our very popular historical highway marker program. I'm sure you've all seen the silver and black signs on the sides of Virginia's roads. We do have the oldest highway marker program in the nation. And I think we had someone that I saw chime in from Winchester. So you might recognize one of my favorite markers in Winchester for the Patsy Cline House there on the screen. All of the work that we do at DHR, all of our program areas begin with the identification of historic resources through survey. A historic resource survey enables us to know what we're working with so that we can make the best plan for how to preserve it. A historic resource survey can be below ground, archaeological, or it can be above ground, architectural. But either way, it's the process of identifying resources, gathering data about them, and then organizing that data into a useful and shareable tool. So that might sound like a pretty broad definition, but there is a standardized formula to perform a historic resource survey. A successful historic resource survey is composed of 3 key stages, and you see those listed here. The first is planning. You have to figure out what you're looking for, what you're looking at. What's the scope of your survey? It might be just your property and the resources, the buildings, objects, structures, sites on your property. It might be an entire county. It might be the whole state of Virginia. You got to know what you're looking for. Background research will show you what's already known about the focus of your survey. Once you've done your background research, you actually have to go out into the field and locate and record the items that you're focusing on. That generally consists of taking lots of photos and notes. The field survey portion of a survey, that can take as little as half an hour, or it can take many months, depending on what you're looking at. Then once you've returned from the field, you've got to organize the data you've collected, both in background research and field work, into something that's useful and makes sense both for you and for others. In Virginia, we require that all survey performed for projects that the Department of Historic Resources is involved in get entered into an online survey database known as the Virginia Cultural Resource Information System, or VCRIS. So VCRIS is how we organize survey data for projects that we're involved with or that require input from our office. Once your information is organized and shared through a system like VCRIS, it can be helpful not only for you, but also for others who might be interested in learning more about what it is that you've surveyed. So a database like VCRIS, it provides kind of a shared space to make historic resource survey information accessible to all. Within architectural survey, above ground survey, there are several different types or categories of survey that you can do. The broadest level of survey is called windshield because it's often performed from a car. It's more or less intended to show you, is there or is there not historic resources in an area, presence or absence, but not as much to provide specific information about those resources. It's generally done in advance of a more detailed survey. Kind of the equivalent of if you're producing an outline for a paper that you're going to write later. A reconnaissance level survey, it's more detailed. You assess each property in your project area, taking photos of all of the resources on that property and writing descriptions for each of them. Reconnaissance level survey doesn't include interior documentation. It's outsides of buildings only, and it's usually performed from the public right-of-way, so streets and sidewalks, just like you see in the photo on the screen. And then finally, you've got an intensive level survey, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's more intensive. You've got interior and exterior documentation, sometimes measured drawings. You want to have really clear notes and descriptions of every resource on every property in your project area. Intensive level surveys are usually done before a property is going to be demolished, or if you're pursuing state and national register listing for that property. If any of you on the call have ever worked with DHR on a preliminary information form for which we determine eligibility for the National Register, that's an intensive level survey. That's a good example of that. The vast majority of survey that's completed for DHR for things like our environmental review projects and our historic district nominations, that's reconnaissance level. And so you can see on the screen here a list of what we're assessing at each property at the reconnaissance level. We essentially want to know, what's on the property? What is the landscape like? Is there any publicly available historical information? And then again, descriptions of each resource, looking at things like form, material, composition, architectural style, if there is one, age, and unique features. And I hope that you're noticing here that the information we're looking for is very different from what a land surveyor or a property assessor might be looking at. A historic resource survey documents historic resources, buildings, objects, structures, sites, districts, and their value, their historic significance, but we're not looking at monetary value, and we're not even necessarily concerned with the exact dimensions of the properties that we're surveying. A historic resource survey, it's the first thing that you need to do when you're working with a historic property, and it can take many different forms. I'm showing you on the screen here a picture of a survey DHR did a couple of years ago that actually took place from the river. But it's important to note that there are many things that a historic resource survey does not do. It doesn't automatically list anything on the National Register. It's the first step towards National Register listing, but the survey in itself does not result in a listed property. Of course, if you're included in a historic resource survey, there's no change to how you can use your property. No restrictions. You don't have to seek permission from DHR to do anything on your property. You certainly don't have to open it to the public. And as I just mentioned, we're not assessing the monetary value of properties when we do a historic resource survey. So your property assessment's not going to fluctuate as a result of a historic resource survey. Okay, so I've shared what it means to do a historic resource survey, but let's get a little further into why we would want to survey our old places. So you see this pyramid on the screen: identification, evaluation, and treatment. These are the three main tools in our preservation toolkit. Identification through survey tells us what we have. Once we've identified something, we can evaluate it for state and national register eligibility. And then resources with particular historical significance are often the ones selected for treatment, meaning actual bricks and mortar preservation through programs like the rehab tax credits, which you'll hear about from Serena. So you can see here that the identification, it's the base of the pyramid. It's what we have to do the most of, because we want to identify through survey as many historic resources as possible to better inform which resources we're going to evaluate and treat. So historic resource surveys support all of the Department of Historic Resources programs. They're the first step, as I've mentioned, towards state and national register listing, and they're essential for any community's preservation planning programs. Beyond just DHR programs, documenting historic resources through survey is also an essential part of advocating for an important place. You can't be a good steward for a historic resource like the Pine Grove Rosenwald School, for example, unless you have some basic information about what it is exactly that you are stewarding. And so survey gives you that basic information. When it comes to Rosenwald schools in particular, we're really fortunate that Preservation Virginia completed an effort several years ago to survey every standing Rosenwald school in the state. So we have really good up-to-date information about that category of resources. And I'll talk in just a moment about how to access the information on those and other surveyed sites. Another reason to do a historic resource survey, unfortunately, we can't save every important old building, object, structure, site, or even district. So we do a historic resource survey because it's sometimes the only way to preserve a place that's going to disappear soon. I surveyed this house in Essex County several years ago. As you can see, it wasn't long for the world then. I'm not sure what condition it's in now, but at least we have some good baseline documentation about what it looked like before it's gone. Yet another reason to perform historic resource survey is to know what you have and what condition it's in before a disaster strikes. We know that here in Virginia, we get all sorts of disasters and inclement weather. Up-to-date pre-disaster documentation is absolutely key for a speedy recovery, for putting things together after a storm or an earthquake or a fire has happened. So a historic resource survey will give you photos and descriptions that can be stored in digital format in the cloud at a repository like DHR, so that you can easily retrieve those later if you need to make insurance claims or apply for relief monies, or as is happening in this photo here, just to figure out how to put that historic building back together. My last couple minutes, I want to share with you how to access survey data for places that we've already documented. DHR has surveyed more than 250,000 historic resources all across the state of Virginia, both architecture and archaeology. That's certainly not every historic place in the state, but if you're not sure if your historic property or your area or area that you're interested in has been surveyed before, a good first step is to reach out and ask us. We can share survey information that we've got with you digitally, or you can come to our physical archives in Richmond and see what we have in person. And our survey records, they may include both write-ups of buildings on properties, as well as photos, recent photos, historic photos, maps, information about National Register evaluations, correspondence about the property in question, and more. So it's a mix as to what we have for properties that we've surveyed. So it's always a good idea to reach out to us and ask at the start of your process. Our existing survey data, as well as information for newly surveyed places, can also be accessed digitally in the Virginia Cultural Resource Information System that I mentioned a moment ago. Again, it's our statewide database of historic resources. It is a subscription database, but which means that we require many folks who are using it to pay for it, but you can access it for free by visiting our Richmond archives. And then there are two places to access limited information about DHR's historic resource survey records for free. The first is the VCRIS map viewer, which provides, again, limited information on above ground architectural survey records. We don't show information for archaeology survey records because those tend to be a little bit more sensitive. We don't want any looting to happen based on sharing the wrong information. So it's just architecture. The map viewer will display the location and the record identification number assigned to every property surveyed in VCRIS. And you can bring that identification number to DHR staff, myself and our archive staff, so that we can quickly provide you with more information. The map viewer is kind of like a starting place in your research process before reaching out to DHR staff to find out more. We also recently debuted our free Places Explorer tool. The Places Explorer allows you to zoom to an area and see what National Register listed places or historical highway markers are nearby. It doesn't show you specific survey records. It's more of an educational tool to show you things that we've already designated, but it's pretty fun to play around on. And if you look in both of these sources and you realize that the historic resources that you're interested in has not been surveyed, you can always reach out to DHR staff, myself, or others to help you in creating a survey record. I'm going to drop my contact information as well as information for a couple of my colleagues into the chat at the end of my presentation. So just to recap, a historic resource survey is important because it provides that key baseline documentation before you take additional steps to preserve an important place, supports preservation planning activities, helps to mitigate threats from natural disasters, makes valuable information about historic resources available to others who might benefit from it. And it's also a great way to talk to people about preservation. We always do public meetings when we're setting off on survey projects funded by DHR. And often when you're out in the field recording historic places, you'll have opportunities to speak with property owners about the history of their community. So many different benefits. And on the screen here, you can see a wide range of historic resources recently documented through DHR's grant programs. So with that, I'm going to say thank you so much. My contact information is on the screen here, but again, I'll drop that information as well as a link to DHR's archives and the Places Explorer into the chat in just a minute. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Blake. That was amazing information. So now moving right ahead, we will hear a little bit from Zarina Fazalden. And if you will give me a few minutes while I share my screen.
And sorry, I'm going to jump back on to say, I actually have to go talk about Historic Resource Survey to another webinar today. So I'm going to take off soon, but please do reach out if you have any questions. And thanks again, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Blake. All right, Zarina, feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you for having me today. My name is Zarina Fazalden, and I was born in Kenya and grew up in Tanzania, that is in East Africa. I left my home in Tanzania and traveled to India for my college education and received my bachelor degree in sociology in India. Soon from India, I decided to come to USA for my master's in sociology. And I picked Richmond, Virginia. And while I was here, I worked as a waitress, first at the Jefferson Hotel, and earned my money for college. And soon after, I moved to social services and worked there for a few years, and decided to go ahead and become a special education teacher. While as a teacher, I decided maybe now it's about time for me to go ahead and purchase my first home. And looked around everywhere in Richmond. I was in Churchill, I was in the Museum District. I went around in Jacksonwood and ended up in Carver for the dream of my home, and never knew that this will move me to a new career in the restoration of the Richmond's home in African-American community. As you could see, that is a very huge building that is sitting in the middle of the historic Carver district. And At that time, when I was interested in buying a home, I was more focused to have a duplex so that I can rent one home for myself. I can live in one home for myself and rent the other one for more income. And this had 4 units in it. It was very huge for a first person, for the first time homeowner in a historic area, historic building. One didn't know where to start. However, as soon as I entered inside, I fell in love with this building. And I was very disappointed that it was boarded for so many years. And learn the history of this building. This is a Queen Anne building, and it was designed by an African-American, Daniel Farrar, and it was built by majority African-American contractors and craftsmen. It was built for the true reformer bank cashier, whose name was Reuben Martin. In 1910, this structure gained the most attention in Richmond and everywhere in East Court and South Side because of the embezzlement of the bank and the collapse of the bank. Reuben embezzlement and mismanagement left the bank collapsed, and it was rumored to have left to Canada and never got back. This news went all over the South Side and East Coast, and here I was now to put back this building back to what it was before. I received the best business partner, then Mr. Lonnie Shiflett, who came and helped me in this large project. And soon after the construction of this building, we moved to other homes around that were so many boarded in the Carver area. As you can see, the second photo there was one of the buildings that was caught in fire. And we restored that building to its original. And why and Carver? Why will you think I had gone to Carver and found my first home? Carver, it is in a historic district. It is bounded on the Belvedere, on the east, and also on the west on Lombardy. It is composed primarily in the late to Italian, with Italian structures. You could find the brick row house, the frame dwelling. In the 19th to 20th century residential, we had commercial building, we had churches, we had school, we had small shop. Majority of the building were constructed during a period of economic growth that took place in Richmond between the 80s and early 90s. And the original settler in Carver community, Carver district, were Jewish and Germans and blue collars, and they were blue collars worker. But in 1900, the Carver was thriving, Black neighborhood with strong social institution, which had a tie with Jackson Wood. But after the construction of several major roadways, Carver, like Jackson Wood, it declined dramatically. But then we have 1980s, the neighborhood started the renewal. And you can see this is one of the buildings behind Mr. Hill's home that was a carriage home that was restored. And you can see the inside how the building was left deteriorated and was restored and received a historic tax credit. And that is the restoration that was done inside and restored this building. And next, we'll go to the next slide. And this is one another restoration that was done. It is located at 1217 today. The John Veterinary Care is one of the most popular veterinarian in Richmond. And the Carver School that played very important role earlier. So you could see my interest in Carver. I stayed there for almost 7 years, but I have invested lots of my constructions home and in Carver because the community with a strong history and the homes were left to be deteriorated, and one by one, starting in one homes, we went to move to another block, and the historic homes were brought back to life. And what helped me most was the historic rehab tax credit. It was important for me to use so that we can make the balance with the expenses of the old homes. Next. And recently, after finishing several homes in Carver, I was approached by Historic Richmond to a house that was left abandoned for many years. And that was Dr. William Hughes' house. But before that, let's go back to before Dr. Hughes' house, I did one commercial building that is behind Maggie Walker's home. And the restoration did very well. And I couldn't keep it. I did sell the building. And since I love the history of Jackson Wood, I wanted to continue with construction in Jackson Wood. And I was approached by the Historic Richmond to restore Dr. Williams' Hughes home. This was Dr. Williams' home when he was living then. And let's go to the second. And that's Dr. Hughes with his family sitting in front of their home. And that was on the left side, that was again, very sad, Dr. William Hughes' home. But let's talk a little bit about Jackson Wood. What was my interest? What pushed me to move and live in Jackson Wood recently? I love the history of Jackson Wood because largely both during the enslaved Black citizen and European, they lived in Jackson Wood. Throughout the late 1800s, the demographic of Jackson Wood shifted to be up to 90% Black resident. The Jackson Wood was often called the Black Wall Street of America. Black-owned banks, theaters, small businesses, mainly located on the 2nd Street. Maggie Lena Walker, the businesswoman and a teacher, first African-American woman to charter the bank and serve as a bank president, lived in Jackson Wood. The St. Luke Penny Saving Bank was opened by Maggie Walker and became the longest running bank-owned bank in Jackson Wood. Also, my interest in this building, beside being boarded and beautiful inside, this was built by the architect Charles Russell. Charles Russell was the first residence and African-American architecture who helped transform lots of homes in Jackson Wood. From Russell's drawing, most of the major buildings constructed for African-Americans in Richmond were built usually with Black contractors and craftsmen. However, unfortunately, many of Russell buildings have been lost in the construction of the Interstate 95. Charles Russell is the most noted African-American Richmond whose name is associated with the architect, usually at Virginia Union University. Aside from being a professor at Virginia Union University, Russell designed several buildings, including the Belgian building in Virginia Union University. So Dr. Williams U House was designed by Charles Russell. It is a 4-square style home. And it was left, as you can see the condition here, the property was left to be deteriorated. And in 1949, before Russell passed away, he transferred the property to the state to build the Negro Training Center for the Blind, the only training center in Virginia. It later became the Commission for the Visually Handicapped till 1970. So when I arrived and visited the building, it was so painful for me to see a beautiful building inside, and some area were deteriorated and some area looked okay, and hesitated to purchase it. But my love for the historic home, I decided I will go ahead and take the challenge and restore this building and bring it to what you see today on the screen, on the slide. It wasn't an easy step, it was a difficult step, but with contractors, with the right contractors, with the right business partner, it was, and getting historic tax credit with the Virginia Housing Help, I was able to restore this home and bring it to original architect. As you could see, all the walls, all the doors, all the floors, they were all infested, especially the floor, with the termite through the damage, water damage. But, and so many other, like the doorknobs were missing, the mantles were missing, and we had to bring back and maintain whatever was there. And now we had the core club where community around in Jackson Wood attended, and community from everywhere in the different part of the Richmond district area participating in the opening, realizing what the house that was ready to be demolished today has become one of the most beautiful, admired home in Jackson Wood. We had almost 200 individuals coming to look at the Dr. Russell's home, Dr. Yu's home. And at the end, we were fortunate to receive the Golden Hammer as the most restored home in Richmond for the last 2 years. And going back now, we see, okay, why historic homes? Why did I focus mainly with the historic home in Jackson Wood and Carver district? These were all homes that were built by the African American mainly, and has history of very important people. And bringing back the old homes, it brings back the neighborhoods like those who built. It creates a sense of place and continuity of the attraction of the African American community. The revitalization helped attract investment in our community. Most importantly, create a symbol of community heritage. The family can come back and look at the house that used to be owned by the family and they tell the story about what the place was and connect us from the past to the present.
Great. Thank you so much, Mrs. Alden, for sharing your story and what you've done preservation-wise in some of these great neighborhoods of Richmond. Now we will move to Kyle Hart, and Kyle will talk about some coalition building and advocacy. Kyle, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for being on. If you give me one moment, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint slides. So if you just sort of bear with me while I get that going, and then we'll be off to the races. So my name is Kyle Hart. I work with the group called the National Parks Conservation Association. I am a sort of a program manager for our Mid-Atlantic region, and our sort of Mid-Atlantic region is basically the Chesapeake Bay watershed, with sort of the core area being Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. A little bit about NPCA. NPCA was founded in 1919, so we're a little more than 100 years old. We were founded by the first National Park Service director, who recognized after he left the National Park Service that the National Park Service and national parks would need sort of an advocacy arm to stand up and advocate on behalf of them sort of in the years to come. And so that's what NPCA does. There are currently, I believe, 424 national park sites, though that sort of occasionally ticks up, and I might be a little behind the 8 ball. We work quite literally, if there are national parks somewhere, we work there. So we're in Alaska, Florida, California, and kind of everywhere in between. We have 1.7 million members and supporters nationwide, with about like 43,000 of those being in the state of Virginia. If you want to learn more, our website is sort of there. It's obviously not linked, but we're pretty easy to find. A little bit about myself. I grew up in sort of rural Virginia, a small town of Farmville, Virginia. Was lucky to be very close and surrounded by kind of historic resources growing up. Grew up very close to High Bridge and learned sort of the history of the Civil War and the Battle of Sailor's Creek, and was fortunate to visit both many national parks growing up, as well as sort of numerous historic sites, Civil War battlefields, and others. So I was asked today by Sonia to talk a little bit about what to do if a historic site in your area, if you find out it's under threat. And so frankly, this is going to be a hard thing to talk about, because I think right out of the gate, all threats are a little bit different. And, you know, so kind of going back to what some of our previous speakers were saying is, at the end of the day, simply being designated a historic place doesn't necessarily, you know, predicate certain protections to a property or a parcel. You know, on one hand, that obviously presents lots of benefits that can encourage, you know, property owners and landowners to sort of recognize their parcel as National Register of Historic Places. Of course, the problem with that is if the parcel changes hands, oftentimes due to sort of a death in a family, and, you know, the property goes to sort of mixed siblings, or, you know, of that nature, where you have 4 or 5 siblings who are in disagreement about what to do with the parcel, the historic property. A lot of times sale becomes the easiest option, and lots of people buy historic properties, frankly, with sort of demolition in mind. So at the end of the day, you should start by assessing the threat. What does the threat look like? Who will be the deciding bodies? Who are the decision makers? Is it board of supervisors? What are the decision-making points? Who are the various places, or where are the various places that community members can and should have the opportunity to provide input? We're going to talk a little bit about today about how you sort of build a coalition to protect historic property. I think at the end of the day, and I'll get into this a little bit more, nobody should be doing historic preservation work alone. You should always have friends and allies in this work, you know, starting with Preservation Virginia, National Parks Conservation Association, and we'll get into a little bit more down the road, but having a coalition is always beneficial. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to speak out, when to speak out, what that can and should look like, the various tools that community members have at their disposal, and that sort of thing. So first and foremost, I got into this a little bit. Every threat is different. And so I think starting out, you should determine what that threat looks like. Look at these proposals, maps, applicant submissions, anything you can find. Talk to your neighbors, friends. Where did you learn about this? Talk to the people you learned about this from. Particularly so a lot of where we see these sort of threats to historic resources end up is in rezoning conversations. So your decision makers are going to be sort of planning commission, historic commission, board of county supervisors, town councils, those types of folks, sort of local land use decisions. Oftentimes always rezoning applications are submitted sort of with a packet, which includes site plans, redevelopment proposals, maps, that sort of thing. Dig into those, really spend some time. Obviously you could do that sort of at your leisure, but you often have a deadline that sort of looks like, oh, you might have 2 months to comment. So be aware of deadlines. A lot of these submissions and applications can be lengthy. Sometimes 200 pages is not uncommon with sort of documents that include proffer statements and things written by lawyers and various maps and that sort of thing. So spend some time with these documents, really get to know them. And I think at the end of the day, never hesitate to reach out towards whether it's local planning staff or DHR staff or advocacy allies. Say, hey, what does this mean? And, I've never looked at a proffer statement before. What's included here? What am I missing? That sort of stuff. You should always dig a little bit into like what's driving the proposal. A lot of times it's financial interest. That could be private financial interest. Other times it's tax dollar driven. You might have a board of supervisors for instance, the board of supervisors might view an old abandoned house on a prime corner lot as a prime opportunity for sort of to build the tax base, tear that down and build a convenience store. So it's good to understand where these proposals are coming from. That can make you, sort of a better and more effective advocate. I touched on that a little bit, what's sort of driving this conversation. Always know who your decision makers are. At the end of the day, who has the final say over this sort of decision is who you need to be spending the most time talking to. I always talk about sort of knowing the difference between who has the final say and who is an important voice in this conversation. For instance, if your decision maker is a board of supervisors member, they're the ones that are going to have the final say, but they might care about what the state representatives and the state senators have to say. They might care about what the historical commission or the planning commission has to say. So recognize that over the course of the process, you will have the final vote, the final decision maker versus sort of the votes that lead up to that. Recognize those, use those as your decision point, but also sort of leverage your advocacy and use your, sort of the resources at your disposal, and never lose sight of that final goal of, who your final decision maker is. One of the things that I think NPCA sort of does really well, and, one of the reasons that Sonia asked me to be here today is to talk a little bit about how you build a coalition. So first and foremost, coalition building is all about knowing who your friends are. Sometimes this is really obvious and sometimes it's not. I like to say, this is not a very uncommon expression, but politics really does and can make strange bedfellows. It is amazing, particularly in the historic conservation community, who you often find yourself partnering with. That could be, traditional sort of right and left interest merging for historic preservation. That could be sort of private property rights people and, maybe sort of the government all kind of merging together. You need to know who your friends and your allies are in this. When you look around and think about who your allies are, know the resources that are at your disposal. So I've listed 2 organizations here that I think are for the historic preservation and environmental community extremely invaluable. And so the Virginia Conservation Network, I'm going to make a small plug. NPCA is a member, Preservation Virginia is a member. This organization is sort of the coalition of all of the environmental and historic preservation groups in the state of Virginia. There's over 250 partners. This is like local land trust. This is statewide groups. This is national groups. These are the people, if you go through this list, look at you can look at them regionally, who's in your area. You can look at them statewide. If your issue is in regards to the battlefield trust, does the battlefield have a friend or a battlefield threat? Does the battlefield have a friends group? Have you contacted the American Battlefield Trust? Have you contacted the different groups that do that type of preservation? Virginia United Land Trust is much more land oriented, but it's good to have friends in the land conservation community, particularly as these threats sort of pertain to the land use. At the end of the day, they often come down to land use decisions. So know who your land use people are. Building a coalition is literally as simple as picking up the phone or sending an email and saying, hey, this is what's going on. Do you want to be a part of this? It's very, very helpful to hold Zoom calls with partners or in-person work sessions, sort of depending on who you're meeting with and where people are coming from. I cannot stress sort of the importance of having those conversations, setting the groundwork, recognizing who's doing what, the roles and responsibilities of each group. And then one very way to sort of secure buy-in, and I'll talk a little bit about this and sort of tactics and strategies here in a second, start like laying the groundwork. A very good way to do this is simply a sign-on letter or a petition where each individual group, the only thing they have to do is read it, say, yes, I agree with that, and then lend their name and organizational credibility to the work that you're doing. I'll talk a little bit about a case study that we had in Prince William County, kind of at the end of my proposal, and I'll talk a little bit about, at one point we had 30 different environmental and historic preservation communities signed on to a letter. Most of those organizations only knew about this issue on the periphery, but they knew that we had this coalition, that we were tracking this, that we were a trusted resource. And they said, if this is something that's important to you, we are happy to lend our name and our credibility to this issue. So I say all of that by saying, building those relationships and having those conversations, establishing yourself or your organization as sort of a credible, trusted person on the ground can be very invaluable to sort of building broad coalition support later on. So if you're not familiar with those two organizations, spend half an hour on their website, sort of poking around, recognize sort of some of who your allies and friends could be in the future. So this is where sort of the rubber meets the road on a lot of these conversations. How do you speak out? Where do you speak out? When do you speak up? So this, at the end of the day, kind of comes down to your personal bandwidth, the time you have, your capacity. But the first and foremost thing you need to do is raise community awareness. That can take many, many shapes. That can be an event near your site, on the site. For instance, if the site is public, battlefield land, that sort of thing, National Park Service property, it's pretty easy to host events there. Sometimes you need a permit, but that's sort of a conversation for a different time. You can start collecting emails and sending emails, ask people to forward emails. It's amazing how quickly an email list can sort of pick up speed if you're sending out content regularly and your emails are being forwarded around. There are various tools out there that are fairly cheap or even free that are able to share emails to a list. I'll say that the two lists I said earlier, the Virginia Conservation Network and the Virginia United Land Trust, sort of house their own list. And if you become a partner, which is oftentimes very cheap or very or often even free buy-in, that gives you access to their list. And so like within reason, within discretion, you can share campaign updates and progress with those individuals. You're also going to want to reach out and garner media attention. Sometimes it's as simple as calling the local reporter in your town and saying, hey, have you seen this issue? Offer tours, offer in-depth and long-term conversations. If you're not sure who to reach out to, at a local paper, there are sort of two ways you can do it. The first is go and look at sort of that paper and who is covering those issues, who is covering environmental historic issues in that paper. For larger papers like the Richmond Times or the Washington Post, it is often the same person covering historic issues in the state, like writ large. It's the same person, that's who you need to reach out to. Smaller local papers, they may only have one or two people, and sometimes those people cycle. So you can either A, reach out to that individual person directly, or a lot of times they will just have general phone numbers, email addresses you can reach out to and say, hey, I'm working on this issue. We'd love for you to cover it. I cannot stress enough how invaluable tours are, at-length conversations. These are people that you want to build long-term relationships with if you think this issue has the potential to go for more than one or two stories. You want to meet with the decision makers, the decision-making bodies, key players. Try to meet with the people if they're willing. Try to meet with the people who are posing the threat. It never hurts to sort of meet with those individuals and see if you can't come up with an amicable solution sort of beforehand. Always attend these work sessions, attend these public hearings that are being hosted by the various decision-making bodies. This is your opportunity to be engaged as well as your opportunity to sort of be on the ground and know what's going on. When I say use the tools at your disposal, what I mean by that is rely on what you have. Don't, my next point is think outside of the box. Don't necessarily do things or dream up things that you may not be able to have. So if you have relationships with key individuals, lean into those. If you know a board of supervisors member, or you have a friend who knows a board of supervisors member well, lean into that. Use the tools at your disposal. Use Preservation Virginia, use National Parks Conservation Association, use the Department of Historic Resources as you're developing this conversation. And then thinking outside the box, no idea is a silly idea when you're thinking about historic preservation. I will say a lot of it's probably been done before. Candlelight vigils are something that a lot of people think of when they're thinking of, historic preservation and, the possible loss of a place. Other sort of interesting eye-catching events, that sort of thing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I know my time is kind of running thin here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Prince William Digital Gateway, which is sort of a case study of how to preserve historic preservation, some failures, and sort of this is an ongoing case. So if you're unfamiliar with this case, this is literally at the gates of Manassas National Battlefield Park. They're proposing this site, or they're proposing to build data centers on currently registered National Register of Historic Places ground inside of the Manassas National Battlefield Historic District. Many of the developments sort of include ground that is in the American Battlefield Protection Program core area. I say all of that to say that unfortunately, this doesn't necessarily preclude these areas from development. At the end of the day, the land remains private land, and sort of the conversation becomes a political one, as well as sort of a personal persuasion one for the developers, landowners, and that sort of thing. This case has been ongoing for 2 years and likely will ongo for another year or more. That is my way of saying sometimes these things are slogs. Buckle up, settle in. It's not uncommon for things to last a decade or more. And I know that's like not what a lot of you all want to hear. But I'll talk a little bit about a work that, NPCA has worked on with Elizabeth and others at Preservation Virginia at Jamestown, where they proposed massive transmission lines across the James River. Lots of stuff has happened on that front. It's almost a decade later and we're still not resolved, and that, work is not done. So long story short, some of these things can take a long time. So some lessons learned from our work at the Prince William Digital Gateway. First and foremost, remember to engage all of the various decision makers. It takes time, it takes effort, but you should be having conversations with as many people who will meet with you. At the same time, you should never forget who makes the final vote. Always keep your eyes on the prize. Recognize at the end of the day who the big important final sort of vote makers will be, and keep them in your sights the whole time. Always, always, always lean on those existing resources, count on sort of the partners in the environmental community, Preservation Virginia, count on agencies like the state parks or National Park Service or DHR. And then the last thing I'll say is, as I mentioned, these things can be slogs. We have lost many votes along the way. Recently, we've had some things kind of go back our way. Keep beating the drum, never give up. These things, we're in it because we believe in these things. That I tell everybody, like, we're fighting the good fight here. I really do believe that historic preservation, larger environmental conservation work, we take some losses, but at the end of the day, the work that we do matters, and keep up the fight. And I think on that, I can conclude and take questions. So thanks to everybody. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and that wraps up all of my time.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle. I do have a couple of questions that I will ask. I know we're kind of running out of time here, but if you have any other questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A. And if we can't get to them, we will answer them in the follow-up. One of the questions that we have is, and this is probably for Blake, and Blake is not here, but I think I can answer it. If a building is already recorded at DHR, but I have more information, such as oral histories, what should I do? And I would answer that by saying, please contact DHR. And I think probably Blake specifically. There is never too much information about historic sites. Everything that you have, whether it's the oral histories or videos or images, it's all important, and it can all be added to DHR's archives and DHR's databases. So I highly recommend sharing whatever you have, and that goes for individuals or historical societies. DHR is and really strives to be that one main repository of information that everyone can go to about all the historic sites in Virginia. So that's what I would do if I was you. And I'm going to send everyone contact information, so you'll get Blake's contact information. Another question I have is probably for Kyle, and you kind of answered this, but is it necessary to work with local governments to save historic places? Is it necessary?
I would say it goes beyond necessary, it's vital. Almost always local governments are the decision-making bodies on these decisions. There are, as I talked about, some sort of state and federal tools that in theory exist. But at the end of the day, a lot of these decisions are made at the county local land use decision level. Local land use decisions make up a lot of the work on historic preservation. So knowing, like, as historic preservationists, knowing who your decision makers are, know your historical commission members, know your board of supervisors as best as you can, lay the groundwork early. That is invaluable to long-term historic preservation. I'll also stress, I kind of talked a little bit about a lot of these decisions come down to the economics. We see that time and time again where, whether it's simply, like I said, a board of supervisor, an old house on the corner, and well, that ought to be a gas station or something of that nature. Talking with decision makers early about both the economic value of historic preservation as well as sort of the historic, the cultural value of historic preservation, and having those decision makers understand that early and often cannot be stressed enough.
Great advice. And the last question that I have is for Zarina. Given today's great need for affordable housing, have you worked with the affordable housing organizations in some of your development projects?
Yes, of course. All my homes that I have now rented, and they are all in affordable housing. And I work with Virginia Housing, used to be known as VHDA, now is Virginia Housing. Yes, that was my interest in restoring the old homes. so that I will be able to accommodate affordable housing for the Richmond residents. And even my last project is also an affordable housing.
Right. Well, we are running out of time. There are a lot of topics that we were not able to cover today. One of them is art and historic preservation, and I'm gonna put some links in. Well, actually, I'll send the links to everyone in the follow-up about how you can use art and historic preservation to get more community involvement. And with that, I think we will end the webinar. Please, if you have the opportunity, sign up for our upcoming webinars. And Elizabeth, do you want to just say bye?
Sure. I want to thank our panelists. I've learned a lot today from listening to you all, and I know I'll have questions to follow up on. I also want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. As Sonia's mentioned, the session is recorded, and we'll be sending out that link as well as posting it to our Preservation Virginia website and DHR's website very shortly. March 29th is our next webinar, Dispelling Common Myths of Historic Preservation. So I bet we all have a few of those that we can brush off and ask questions about. I'd also encourage you to check Preservation Virginia's website for information about some of our other programming and events. On March 21st, we'll have a virtual presentation at coming from the John Marshall House called To Be Purchased and Possessed: Slavery in the John Marshall House. So thank you again to our panelists and to all of you. And as it has been driven home during this session, we're all in this together. So please reach out, form the partnerships and alliances that helps both preserve individual historic properties and builds a stronger preservation community. So thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.